Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us again for another week of our Civics and Citizenship Professional Learning Series, which is brought to you by the Parliament of South Australia, the Commissioner for Children and Young People, and the Department for Education. Um, Ordinarily, I would acknowledge that I'm on Ghana land at Parliament House, but I am actually currently sitting on Narungga country in a gazebo on the beach on the Yorke Peninsula, although you cannot tell. And so I acknowledge the Narungga people as the traditional owners of the land that I am on tonight. And it would be wonderful if in the chat you could indicate where you're joining from this evening so we can see where everyone is coming to us from across South Australia. And it also might be really nice after having had Reconciliation Week, if you wanted to indicate in the chat anything that you did within your classes and within your school communities for Reconciliation Week, because I'm sure you've done some wonderful work with your students. I'm really excited for this session because we are joined by the Honourable Kyam Maher, who is the Attorney General and Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and a member of South Australia's Legislative Council, who will be answering some of the questions you might have and some that we've put together about South Australia's voice to Parliament. I don't want to talk too much about it myself because this session is for you to understand more about the process and how it came to be and what the model looks like. But what I will do is I will pin the Attorney General's video so that you can see his screen. And I thought that I might pass it over to you, Attorney, to see if you had anything that you wanted to say before we start asking you questions.
No, thank you, Natalie. Nothing particular to say. I'm coming to you from Ghana country here in the Adelaide CBD. And by this time tomorrow, I'll be on Larrakia country up in the top end.
Oh, lovely. I have some questions that we've put together to support the teachers with some, I guess, framing context for the voice to Parliament. And then we will keep an eye on the chat and collect any queries that the teachers might have. And the first thing that we had for you, Attorney, was about the consultation process that was used to determine the model proposed for the South Australian voice to Parliament. So can you briefly explain what the consultation was like?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. I can. So we, after the last state election in March last year, we had a policy, a commitment that we would implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full in a South Australian context. So the elements of voice, treaty and truth. And I think like most of the people, the 250 delegates who were at Uluru 6 years ago, and certainly a lot of the thinking and writing that's been done since, we accepted what I think the common view is, that in terms of sequencing, that voice component is the most logical and sensible place to start, that having a voice can then help guide how you implement the other parts of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So upon coming to government in March last year, we pretty quickly set about looking at how the voice part of it would look. We appointed Dale Aegis as our Commissioner for First Nations Voice. And he spent months going out right around South Australia. So I think the most comprehensive consultation any government's done with Aboriginal South Australia. He sort of crisscrossed the state from Mount Gambier, just at Juna, to the APY lands, to Cooper Pedy, Port Lincoln, and all points in between, going out to Aboriginal community organisations, to groups, and to meetings with individuals, looking at how a voice might look in the South Australian context. What were the elements that were important? How it would be selected, or appointed, or elected, what its roles would be, and what its interaction with Parliament and government would be. And as a result of that, the Commissioner for First Nations Voice submitted a report, came back with a whole lot of guiding principles, and as a result, we drafted legislation. And then the Commissioner for First Nations Voice went out again and sort of revisited everywhere that he went for that first round of consultation, and went back and said, look, we've now got a bit of legislation. We heard what you've said. We got the lawyers in Adelaide to draft up a bit of legislation. How did we do? And as a result of that second round of consultation, we made some changes to the legislation and had it in Parliament at the very start of this year. And then on the last Sunday in March, we had a special sitting of Parliament on a Sunday where about 5,000 people attended on outside Parliament House on North Terrace, where there are big screens that played those final stages of the proceedings of Parliament. And then the governor came over from Government House across the road and on a big stage on the steps of Parliament formally and immediately proclaimed the legislation.
And I think some of the teachers that I've been communicating with, some of them might have been at that event, which is really special that they were able to see it with their own eyes to then pass on to the students. And I'm sure we would have had plenty of students there too. The next question that we had put together for you was around the election process. And I know that you recently announced the election upcoming to have the First Nations voice and the local representatives chosen. And so we had put a few guiding questions together, but what's the election process like? So who is allowed to vote? Is it the same criteria for a general state election? Are there any details about the nomination process for candidates? Will there be similar limitations placed on for electoral campaigning? So I'm interested, and I'm sure the teaching community is interested in what the election might look like.
Yeah, so we recently announced the boundaries for the regions for the election and the election timetable. So as a result of all of that consultation, we a few weeks ago had regulations that set the boundaries for 6 local voices. So one that's in the far north, sort of from Woomera right up to the NT border that takes in the APY lands and Cooper Pedy. One that's the west and the west coast, so sort of from Kimber, then Woodner, Port Lincoln over to Ceduna and Yalata. Another one that's the Flinders in the upper north, so taking Whyalla, Port Augusta, then through the Flinders Ranges. Another region that's York in the mid-north, so the York Peninsula, Kadina, up through Burra and Peterborough. One that's the Riverland in the southeast, and a final one that's the Central Ward that takes basically Kaurna Nation boundaries, the Greater Adelaide area. So we've got these 6 regions now set down, and if you go to if you Google SA Voice boundaries, I'm sure you'll be able to find clicks through to exactly how those boundaries look. So there will be the qualification to be able to participate in the elections is an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person, and we've adopted the tripartite 3-part test that was set down in Mabo and most governments use for legislation or for applying programs for Aboriginal people. So if you need to be on the electoral roll and be an Aboriginal person, in which case you can then nominate and vote in the elections. So I think we've set down, I think it's the 17th of July, nominations will be open for a 3-week period. And then on the 9th of September will be the day of voting, including a couple of weeks of pre-poll and mobile polling in the lead up to that. For the central region, the Adelaide sort of region, there are going to be 11 people elected, at least 5 men and 5 women. And then for each of those regional ones, it's 7 people elected. So from right around South Australia, those 6 regions will elect 7 for the sort of regional and remote ones and 11 for the metropolitan region. And then for each of those 6 regions, each of these local regional voices will select 2 people as their presiding officers. And it's those 2 presiding officers that then come together to form the 12-person statewide voice. So that's sort of and again, that was subject to further consultation and input about how those boundaries will look, but they're prescribed by regulation. So they can, and I expect over time, will change. And each local voice will have the opportunity to name their area according to what they wish. And as I said, I'm sure there'll be reviews to look at how that first election went, and the second election and then subsequent elections are due to be on the same day as state elections. So for the next election, it'll be on the 3rd Saturday in March 2026, and then every 4 years after that. So after this first election, it'll be done on the basis of, if you're an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person on the electoral roll, you'll vote in your upper house, lower house of state parliament, as well as the voice.
Thank you. And while you were speaking, I brought up the link that you mentioned about finding the different regions, and I put it in the chat so that the teachers can have a look for themselves. And we did have a question come through related to the regions. Samuel asked how the regions cater to Aboriginal languages and nations within South Australia. So were they adopted around existing country and language groups? And what sort of factors played into determining the regions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we did look to see as much as possible if they could follow nation boundaries and how we group nations together that have similar cultural or geographical interests. In some, it hasn't been completely possible to do that entirely. So there will be some where there's a boundary that goes through a nation, but as much as we could, following nation boundaries.
Thank you. And I think the language question is a really fascinating one too, because providing information in Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara for some of our communities in the APY lands is a really interesting question, particularly in the electoral space, and making sure that we're getting that information out to the communities. Has there been any groundwork happening with the Electoral Commission to be communicating these processes in language?
Absolutely. My last meeting before this this online forum was with the Electoral Commissioner and also the Commissioner for First Nations Voice, and that was one of the things on the agenda. So there'll be written things, posters, and so forth that will be translated. And the Electoral Commission has some experience with that. The Electoral Commission conducts the APY Executives Board's election for their own executive board that manage the APY lands, as well as state elections that have a mobile team through the APY lands. As well, they're looking at a series of resources that can be used on social media. So not just translated written sort of information, but audio and video translated and spoken and filmed as well.
Well, that was very good timing that we managed to catch you just after that meeting then. And I've seen a question come into the chat about state and federal comparisons, but I might return to that afterwards because you've spoken a bit to the model chart that you've got available on the website, and I'll drop a link into there. And the next question sort of flowed on to what you've got your presiding officers, and then they form the voice, and then they can provide advice to government and make comments on legislation. And the next question that we had for you is, which part in the parliamentary process would the perspectives of the voice be raised? So do you envision that happening at the second reading or after the committee stage? Or will this be dependent on what the voice chooses to do?
Yeah, they're really good questions. So I think, Natalie, I went through now the consultation that occurred, how people are elected to the voice. So I might spend a few minutes now going through how the voice interacts with decision makers. And that really is the point of what we're doing. And what is being proposed federally. It's allowing Aboriginal people to have more of a say in the decisions that affect their lives. Really, fundamentally, that's what this is about. So in terms of our state voice, the way that's done is similarly to what's being proposed by the federal alterations to our constitution. It's a voice to our parliament, but it's also a voice to executive government. And this was very clear in our consultations that was something that was very strongly desired. Often by the time you have legislation, a lot of the decisions have already been made. So to have that voice before decisions become legislation, or a lot of the decisions that the government makes aren't legislative decisions. They're implementing programs in education or health or the justice system. So what our legislation provides is a voice both to the executive and to the parliament. So in terms of the executive, there's a requirement that representatives of that statewide voice, made up of a couple of people from each of the local voices, representatives of that statewide voice have a legislated ability to meet with cabinet twice a year, a legislated ability at least twice a year. It doesn't have to be minimum twice. A legislated ability to meet with a group of the public sector chief executives twice a year. There's also a process where once a year, representatives of the statewide voice will choose which ministers or which heads of the public sector they want to talk to about, almost like an estimates process, talk to about spending in their areas, the how policies are being implemented and what's happening. So that's the how it interacts with the executive. The interactions with Parliament is an ability, a requirement that the representative of the statewide voice address a joint sitting, have both houses of Parliament once a year. The statewide voice can provide reports to Parliament on any topic at any of interest to them anytime they choose, and the government of the day has to respond to that report. But importantly, the representative statewide voice can contribute on any piece of legislation. So under the under our First Nations Voice Act, representatives can speak to Parliament once on any bill. So either in the upper house or lower house, not both. And I think it's envisaged, Natalie, to your question, it would, each chamber's got to decide the standing orders and how that work. But I suspect in my discussions, it'll probably take place at the second reading stage of a bill, whether it's a government bill, an opposition bill, a crossbench bill. And it's not to allow for a vote or to move amendments or to block, but to have representative statewide voice view being heard on any piece of legislation. And again, we'll have to do some work about how standing orders look, but it's envisaged that will be from the floor of Parliament. So the way I think it will look is, once on any piece of legislation, a representative statewide voice would have an ability at the second reading stage of a bill to come into Parliament from the floor of Parliament, give their view about the bill. So there's a whole lot of different legislated ways that ensure that Aboriginal people's voices are heard in those sort of government decisions that affect their lives. But similar to what's being proposed federally, there's no ability to block anything. It's very clear that just because the voice doesn't get an opportunity to have its say on something doesn't mean a Parliament can't move ahead with things. We saw during COVID, there were bits of legislation that got introduced on a Tuesday morning and had passed both houses by the Wednesday. And that was necessary because of the rapidly developing emergency that the state was facing. So the bill, our First Nations voice specifically contemplates the fact there will be times where it won't be possible, but that doesn't mean a government can't act when it needs to.
And the way that you've finished up there mentioning, legislation that needs to pass through fairly quickly leads in really well to one of the other questions that we had put forward for you. It was actually a bit further on, but I think it's a nice opportunity to address it now. Is there a time frame for the voice to consider an issue? So if there is an instance where something might need to pass really quickly, is there an anticipated time frame that you would need to give the voice in the event that they would want to consult on that?
No, there's no timeframes, and the legislation is necessarily very clear that because the fact that the voice didn't have an opportunity to put views on something doesn't invalidate anything the Parliament does, and that's something that's been raised as a concern federally as well, that things will be held up, or every single government decision will need approval of the voice. That it's just not the case. It's not the case in what we're doing, and it's not proposed to be the case federally. Our voice is an advisory body. It won't have a power to block or veto. And just because something needs to be considered urgently doesn't mean that the government or the Parliament of the day won't. It doesn't preclude them having the ability to do that, even if it's the case that the voice hasn't yet had an opportunity.
Okay, and that also really nicely leads into sort of the next theme that we had, which is what types of legislation do you think might be of interest to the voice? Will they be choosing bills to advise on at their own discretion?
Yep, yes, indeed. It's of whatever's of interest to the voice. And I suspect over time that's something that the voice is probably going to sit down and refine and decide on. Potentially the voice could provide their view on every single bit of legislation that comes before Parliament, and that would be the right of the voice to do. I suspect in practice, once this is up and running in full effect next year, that the voice will decide, yeah, these are the things we are more interested in other things. And I suspect, in practice, it's going to be a combination of, some things the voice will want to be represented in Parliament on. Changes to child protection regimes, to the Aboriginal Heritage Act. There will be things that the voice, I think, will absolutely want to be heard in Parliament on. I suspect there'll be other things that the voice will perhaps want to put in a written submissions to Parliament. And there will be things that are run-of-the-mill things government does, like updating national electricity regulation, things, legislation that the voice may have no interest in making representations on. But it was very deliberate, and it resolved the consultations that it shouldn't be up to the government of the day or administrative parts of the parliamentary process to decide what the voice is interested in. It should be up to the voice itself.
I'm getting a couple of questions coming through, some to me directly and some in the chat, which is really great that the teachers are obviously really making the most of the opportunity to hear straight from you. So one of the questions that's come in is, will the advice on the voice on a particular issue be confidential or be publicly available?
That will be up to the voice. If a member of the voice speaks in Parliament on a bill, that would form part of the parliamentary record and would be available as every part of the parliamentary record's available. But it is anticipated, I think, that there will be some things that may be culturally sensitive that the voice will want to make a submission on government, so they can make representations to that effect to make it confidential.
And I think that's actually a really critical conversation that we should be having, like how we respect the cultural sensitivity of some of the questions that they might be putting forward and balancing that with the task that we're asking of the voice too. So are there any processes where it would be like very deliberately withheld in order to protect any like cultural requirements?
Yeah, I think when the voice makes a submission, I think this is probably going to be particularly relevant to a cabinet process. The voice, it's not too, it's entirely foreseeable that the voice might want to make something that a submission to cabinet about, a government policy or some decision that's being considered and not want that to be made public. That there might be culturally sensitive matters, and that would be appropriate for a government to respect.
One of the other questions that's come through in the background is a little bit more administrative, but quite interesting. Will the representatives at the local and then at sort of the broader voice with the presiding members coming together, will they have staff, and will they be provided with access to like legal expertise or supporting resources, and will they be paid?
Really good questions, and a lot of these questions were asked extensively when the legislation went through the parliamentary processes earlier this year. A broad answer is to those, yes. There won't be personal staff for each of the 40-odd local voice representatives, but there will be a secretariat that's put together to support the work that both the local voices and the statewide voice does. And I think we are shortly going to recruit the head of that support that will be put forward. I expect that in terms of seeking advice, that the representative voice will regularly ask of government departments to provide information about what they're doing, and government departments will necessarily do that as a matter of course of what they do. There is a provision, and I think for the next 4 years, it's just a bit over $10 million that's been allocated for two aspects of the voice. One is the running of elections. This first election set for September, then the one to coincide that'll be of significantly less cost because it's at the same time as the state election. But then allocation for yearly funding for those support staff for the voice. And it won't be a large amount, but a small amount that members will receive in recognition, like anyone who serves on a government board or a committee, of their time. And also some funding to make sure the voice can do things it needs to, like hire a hall or a meeting room for a meeting, for travel allowance for members of the voice who need to travel to get to their local voice meetings, or probably more importantly, from wherever they are in regional South Australia, Adelaide, for statewide voice meetings or to make representations in Parliament. So yeah, there will be a small amount of payment for members of the voice for their services, which is usual for government, for boards and committees. There will necessarily be there is necessarily funding put aside to allow people to get to meetings, and also that sort of secretariat ability in addition to government providing information the voice is going to need.
The next question that has come through is actually a really fantastic one. And what do you think the role of teachers should be in regards to teaching students about the voice? And I guess in the federal context with the upcoming referendum, like what value is there in teachers sharing their personal views on the issue in school settings? So I guess what would you like to be seeing happening in classrooms?
Yeah, look, this isn't up to me to tell teachers what personally they should do in classrooms. What I can tell you though is why I think it's important from my own experience. I've been working in and out of Aboriginal affairs most of my adult life, working life for over 20 years, and one thing I am absolutely certain of is that the services and programs that government provide for Aboriginal people work best when Aboriginal people get more of a say in how those programs look. I'm absolutely certain of this, and something that elevates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices, and as I said, to have more of a say in those decisions that affect their lives, I think will lead to better programs and better outcomes. It almost boils down to that sort of simplicity, Natalie. As I said at the start, this is about Aboriginal people getting more of a say in the decisions that affect their lives. And from my point of view, what governments, whether they're Labor or Liberal governments, have done for decades, haven't seen the results we should see. Every year in Canberra, the Closing the Gap report's handed down, and you see a little bit of progress. You see precious little progress in a lot of other indicators, and in some areas you see Aboriginal people going backwards. It is a remarkable thing that we count amongst Australia the oldest living culture on the planet, but on nearly every measure you see, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people fare worse of any group of people in Australia. The one statistic, the fact that if you're a male born on the APY lands in South Australia today, you have an average life expectancy of 48 years. In a state and a country as prosperous as ours, these are alarming statistics, and clearly we haven't been what we've been doing hasn't been working as well as it should. So to try something different, to try have a process that allows Aboriginal people more of a say, I can't see what the harm could be. And the worst thing that can happen is governments are going to have to take into consideration, not be bound by, not have anything stop, but take into consideration the views of Aboriginal people in a greater way than has been in the past.
Yeah, some of those reports and the statistics are particularly powerful, just in the messages that the data carries, and I personally find that it's very helpful in a classroom context to let the students make the decision on these things themselves, but provide them with the broader context and the information to inform themselves. One of the other questions that has come through is about how the voice will work alongside existing groups. So, for example, the community corporations that already oversee land. What's the relationship going to look like between the voice and some of these existing groups?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it certainly was raised during the consultations with things like health services, legal services, Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, as well as native title groups. And certainly the aim is, this doesn't replace any of those things, but this is a further mechanism and avenue for voices to be elevated and heard. And certainly we had representations during the consultations that, well, maybe the voice could be made up of all of the native title groups in South Australia rather than the elections we're going down the path of. But although that would have been one way to do it, that would have then excluded anyone who wasn't a member of a native title group in South Australia. So an Aboriginal person from Perth now living in Adelaide faces many of the same issues, but would have then, under that sort of model, been excluded from the voice, or members of the stolen generations who've not yet been able to find their way home would have been excluded. So there were different views or different suggested models that were put up. One thing we did change in the legislation after it went out for that last round of consultation was to make it very, very clear in the legislation that nothing about the voice supersedes, interrupts, or denigrates from any other agreement or anything any other group does or will do in the future. So to make it very, very clear that this doesn't replace anything that already happens, but it is in addition to anything that happens now or any other groups or agreements that might occur.
We might get a little bit more technical now. We do have primary and secondary teachers present, and some of the senior secondary teachers, particularly at SACE level, will talk about regulations and delegated legislation. So what is the anticipated relationship the voice might have with consulting on regulations and delegated legislation? Would it be primarily through advice to the government?
Yeah, well, so we talked about the primary legislation. Any bill before Parliament, the voice has an ability to speak on. In terms of those subordinate legislation, like regulations that are put forward before Parliament, there'd be no reason the voice, if they chose to, couldn't submit a report about their views on any regulation that was put before Parliament. And of course, either chamber of Parliament can disallow a regulation. So that would be one way if the voice chose to on any of that subordinate regulation regulations. Views could be heard. Overwhelmingly, regulations are pretty non-controversial and are administrative in nature that support legislation that's already passed. But if there was something that was by regulation, there's no reason the voice couldn't, for example, put in that ability for a written report about their views.
And another one for our SACE level teachers, do you anticipate that the voice would be submitting to parliamentary inquiries and committees as well if they're doing a particular inquiry into a certain area?
It would be absolutely open for the voice to do that. If there was a parliamentary inquiry or a committee that was looking at a particular thing or issue that the voice felt was relevant and of interest, it would be completely open to put in submissions in relation to that. And I guess that highlights the importance of having that secretariat of the voice who can help provide that support in putting these things together.
There were some earlier questions that came through about the relationship between a state model and a federal model. And obviously the way that we achieve a voice is very different at a state level compared to a federal level. And maybe it would be interesting to hear. I know that the Prime Minister visited South Australia last week and commended South Australia on its voice to Parliament. Were there any reflections of it or any elements from the South Australian model that might be taken and adopted federally? I know a lot of the guiding principles come from the Statement of the Heart, but I'm interested to hear whether or not any elements of the South Australian model are inspiring what might happen federally.
Yeah, certainly the sort of those core elements of what makes up our voice is very, very similar to what's being proposed federally. And I talked earlier about it's not just a voice to the Parliament, it's a voice to the executive government, which is what's being proposed under the second subsection of the new proposed section 129 of our federal constitution. But in terms of our relationship, I suspect we may see something very similar should the referendum held later this year federally have a yes vote, which I think it probably will. I'm cautiously optimistic about that, and it will be, of course, up to the federal parliament to decide the powers and functions of how their federal voice body looks. But I suspect there'll be some similar elements, and it's almost a weekly basis over the last 12 months or so. I've talked to Linda Burney, the Federal Minister for Indigenous Australians, my federal counterpart, about what we're doing to try and make sure it doesn't cut across anything they're doing federally, but almost more importantly that it has an ability maybe to feed into what's happening federally. And I think there's a better chance than not that should the federal voice succeed, that most other states and territories will end up going down the path we've gone down with a state-based voice, and they may end up being the building blocks for a federal voice. For example, federal legislation could set down minimum requirements for if there's a state body for them to have that and then feed into a federal voice. So one thing I've been very conscious of is trying to make sure that to the greatest extent possible that we can have linkages to that federal voice with what we're doing in South Australia.
And for the benefit of teachers that are on this evening, we will be doing a future session on the federal referendum process, so that way you can understand the mechanics of that a little bit better. There was a question that came through in the background about how politics might influence the elections for the representatives of the local First Nations voice bodies. So do you anticipate that there could be like party affiliations with particular nominations of candidates, or is it encouraged to steer away from that? Has any framework been put in place to monitor how a campaign might be put together?
Yeah, no, it hasn't. Yeah, the electoral commissioner oversees the election, so we'll have rules about campaigning. There's nothing. There's no framework that encourages or prohibits involvement of anyone or regardless of their party beliefs. My guess, Natalie, is I think it's unlikely we'll see party politics playing out in the voice elections. We don't see that generally in local government. There's nothing stopping people running as a Labor candidate or a Liberal candidate for their local ward in local government, and that certainly happens in some places interstate. But we haven't seen it in local government in South Australia, and my guess is that we won't see it playing out for the voice. It'll be completely up to Aboriginal people about who they elect for their local voices, and the local voices putting forward 2 people each to the state voice. And I suspect it'll be people who are elected who are respected in their local communities, regardless of if they've ever had any sort of party affiliation or not.
I had an interesting question come through in the chat, and I might frame it a little bit differently. But throughout the consultation process, what were some of the big concerns that First Nations people were raising about a voice model? Like, what were some of their big fears or potential oppositions to it that you were able to factor into your processes in coming up with the model?
Yeah. So some of a lot of the discussion centered around how we would be established. What were the mechanisms for people becoming part of the voice? And it's overwhelmingly from those who were Aboriginal people involved in the consultation was a directly elected model, which we ended up adopting. Then there are also some of the other questions, the other threshold sort of big questions were, how does it interact with decision makers? And as I've said, we accepted the overwhelming view. It's not just Parliament, but it's the government and the cabinet and the executive that the voice can interact with. And then there were the other questions about exactly how does it relate to the Parliament. There have been other models that have been put up where a voice would speak to a parliamentary committee, and that parliamentary committee would be the vehicle to interact with the Parliament. And again, overwhelmingly, the desire from the consultation was that direct ability to inform Parliament of the views. So they were some of the really big questions that during that first round of consultation. What were the guiding principles? They were some of the sort of big things that were traversed in that first round.
Okay. The questions have slowed down in the chat. So I am just keeping my eye on it to see if there are any further queries coming through. But in the meantime, if we're getting sort of closer to the end of the queries coming in, are there any key pieces of information or any core messages that you want the teaching community to take away and take back to make sure that our students are informed in the way that you like? What's your key message for the teaching community?
From my point of view, and this is something I've said to any group that I've been speaking to about the voice is No one loses from it. There's nothing being taken away from anyone else. No one's losing power. No one's losing ability to make a decision. There's not anything being taken away from people. But as I said at the start, I think there's a fair bit to gain. I think having decision makers hearing Aboriginal voices more loudly, more clearly, I think can only lead to governments making better decisions. So at its core, it's difficult to see how anyone loses anything from this, and I think we have the potential to gain a lot.
Okay, thank you so much. I just put in the chat to see if there were any further questions. And someone said here, do you think there'll be many young people elected to the Voice? And like what mechanisms are in place to try and encompass like a youth First Nations voice?
Excellent question, Natalie. The answer is I don't know. I've had people ask me, and even the Premier's asked me, like when we were putting this through, who do I think is going to be elected? I have no clue, and it's a bit I'm a bit apprehensive about how who might get elected, and the whole point is to hold us to account, which is the point of it. But I really don't know who might be elected. But again, that came through pretty strongly in the consultations that they wanted to make sure young people and elders were included. So one thing we did take into account that changed from the first draft of the legislation that went out is the statewide voice can set up subcommittees it sees fit, but there are 4 legislated required committees to be set up. So there's a requirement to set up a youth committee, and that is each of those 6 local voices appointing 2 youth to form a statewide youth committee, and it'll be up to each of those local voices to decide what they determine as young people. And there's a requirement there, similarly, an elders committee to be set up. So each of those 6 local voices will need to appoint 2 elders to a committee, and that have to be different people from those who are elected on those local voices. The statewide voice will appoint a Stolen Generations advisory committee. And there's also the 4th legislated required committee to be set up is a native title committee. So a representative from each of the PBCs or native title groups, 20 something in South Australia, to represent the views of native title holders. So it was something that that came through particularly strongly. The old people, young people, stolen gens, and native title holders were people that overwhelmingly thought that needed to have some sort of formal mechanism to make views heard. So these are statutorily required committees as part of the voice process.
I'm sure many teachers are now sitting back thinking of some of the incredible young students that they've had come through their classrooms who they might be able to inspire to try and, get involved in like the youth committee and be part of that in the future. And I'm thinking of some of my own former students too from up in the APY lands and imagining the amazing work they could be doing. This question is an interesting one. It's quite tricky. What do teachers need to know about criticisms or opposition to the voice? Like, how can they be responding to this? I think that's very tough, but I'm interested in your perspectives.
Yeah, and again, it's not something I think I'm qualified to give advice to teachers how to respond. In terms of the federal voice, which is very similar to ours, there's on yes23.com.au, there's a series of FAQs and things about from the Yes group, the federal voice. But again, I'll regularly get asked about this. I'm at a shopping centre or at a sporting event, and people raising concerns about how the voice will work. But usually it's about 60 to 90 seconds talking about the fact that this won't be a body that makes any decisions. It won't decide how funding's allocated. It won't be able to stop, block, or amend legislation. It's an advisory body about making sure Aboriginal people get more of a say in the decisions that affect their lives. And nearly always, when it's broken down that simply, people who've had misconceptions or objections, like, oh, well, that sounds entirely reasonable. Why wouldn't you support Aboriginal people getting a bit more of a say? Sure. So just breaking down that simply, in my experience, is something that people have appreciated.
Okay. I haven't seen anything else come through. So if everyone is comfortable with it, and hopefully you've walked away, or you will walk away with a lot of additional information, I think that is a nice sort of message to leave it on. So, you know, reflecting on like some of the Yes 23 comments, but also acknowledging that there's really no losing here. Like it's a scenario where there's a lot of like positive outcomes for everybody, with like almost no negative consequences. Oh, if it's okay, there was one last amazing question that just popped in right now. Is there any legislation within the past 12 months where you would have liked the Voice to have been part of the process?
I have no doubt there's legislation over the last 12 months, but again, this isn't, you know, the benefit of this. It won't be any say of government of the day about what the Voice decides to contribute on. So I'm certain there will have been legislation over the past 12 months that the Voice would contribute on. For example, we passed legislation last year to formally recognise in legislation the Nunga Court, the sentencing court that Aboriginal elders sit on, that has been in operation for some time but has never had a legislative backing. So we established that in legislation where, you know, I'm sure the Voice would have contributed a view on that legislation. So yeah, there will be some things that are very specific to Aboriginal people that I'm sure the Voice would have over the last 12 months contributed on, but yeah, it will be completely up to the Voice to decide what they want to do.
Okay, I'll call it there. Well done to you, Samuel, for sneaking it in right in there. And the additional questions that have come through, I can provide some links for you shortly. And please join us for the referendum session, where we will be unpacking a lot more of the yes, no factors with some academics who will be providing some of their sort of academic commentary in this space. So a huge thank you to you for joining us, Attorney. It's been a pleasure to have you with us, and few people have been saying that they're so grateful for you sharing your time and your explanations and your expertise. That's really wonderful. And I think from all of us, we wish you all the best in finding the best sausage roll in the Northern Territory. For those of you who aren't aware, the Attorney General is a sausage roll aficionado. So all the best to you. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you. Okay. And so for those of you who are still here in the chat before I hit the end button, some of you are asking questions on the yes and no cases. In the follow-up email, when I send your certificates, I'll give you some links where there have been some tables and comparison charts made. Absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. I am away, so I'll try and get your certificates to you ASAP, but I'm teaching all week in the Yorke Peninsula, so I'll get them to you when I can. All the very best to you, and I can't wait to see you in the next week's session. Have a lovely evening.